Hello there and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ. What do we do on this channel? Well, on this channel we talk all about the hobby, whether it's tips and tricks on how to play the game, lore, painting guides, a little bit of drunken explaining. There's a bit of something for everyone, and today, as you can tell from the video, we're talking all about starter armies. Space Marines are the default starter army for most people, but here are a few examples of other armies that are quite good as starter armies. And the thing I want to say before we get too far into it is that when we talk about starter armies, it's not necessarily armies that seem like the most straightforward to paint. That's very much what Space Marines are in a lot of ways. These are armies from a gameplay side of things which are the easiest to understand and help you to get to know the rules and get to know how different aspects of 40k are played. And for today's wonderful model, we are going to be painting this, yes indeed, a wonderful starter model if ever there was one. So without further ado, let's crack on. I'm going to say something quite controversial here, and I'd say that at this stage, Space Marines are probably not the best starter army out there, or at the very least, they're not the only good choice. And the reason I say they aren't necessarily the best is twofold. First of all, whilst the starting boxes are always quite straightforward, it's always the next step that flummoxes a lot of people, because the Space Marine range is both so broad, and there's so much variety in terms of the chapters, the second founding chapters, and everything else that comes with it. So the next steps in terms of what to do with your Space Marines once you start playing can nowadays be really quite difficult to maneuver, and it's hard to navigate exactly what the best choice for you is. So here are a few alternatives to that. And the second reason I say they're maybe not the best choice now is because they are so specific to their colour scheme as well. With armies such as Drakari, Tyranids, and arguably Chaos Marines to an extent, there's a bit more artistic freedom, whereas Space Marines don't have that as obviously when you start playing. And I think this is worth remembering going forward when we talk about some alternative starter armies. And the first starter army that I think is worth remembering that could be a good alternative is the Astra Militarum, or the Imperial Guard. Now, the reason I bring this up is because they are a very, very basic army. They don't have tons of special rules, they don't have a million extra units you need to worry about. The core of their army doesn't really change from army to army or from regiment to regiment. You can actually get quite far with buying multiples of the same thing in a way that you can't really with other armies, and ultimately they do have quite a distinctive profile on the board. And even though I have said that they do need some love and they do definitely need a bit of an update for 9th edition, what they have currently, and hopefully what they will retain going forward, is a very straightforward playstyle that isn't going to get people lost the moment you start looking at them, or when they want to expand. It's a lot clearer what the options are, and you won't get lost trying to figure out what the best choice for you is. Number 2, another good choice, if we go to the Xenos side of things now, is Orcs. Orcs are a bit more fun, I think, than a lot of other armies out there. Now, I don't mean that in the sense that other armies are boring to play or dour or serious, even though some of them definitely are. Looking at you, Death Guard. I can say this, I'm a Death Guard player. But the thing about Orcs is there's a certain lightness and comedy to them that a lot of the other armies don't really have in their codexes or in their background. And I do think that if you want an army which doesn't feel like it has to be taken seriously on principle, Orcs are a good choice. The other thing about Orcs is that even though they do have some special rules and they do have things like the cultures, they aren't necessarily as broad and they aren't quite as huge and easy to get lost in. So it's quite easy to look at the Orc Codex and think this is your lot, there's no additional supplements, there's not tons of special rules you need to go digging through 2 other books to find. It's all in that codex and it all relates to the same thing, getting up close and smashing or shooting lots of guns and enjoying the catharsis of maybe 1 or 2 of them hitting, but those 1 or 2 hitting are all you need because, you know, you're firing 10 rockets from a unit of tank busters. So there's a lot of options and there's a lot of things to get excited about with Orcs. The other thing to remember about Orcs, especially now into 9th edition, is that they have a lot more options, but all of those options can still be tied around to the same place. So once you want to expand your army with Orcs from ordinary boys into maybe more of the beast snaggers, or if you want to have some more of the mechanized things such as their drag racers and their fast units, they're all quite cohesive and they fall into smaller categories, and the categories themselves are still quite straightforward. You can get fast things, heavily armored things, and the aforementioned beast snaggers like I just said. But where this differs to things like just Space Marines is because you don't have the same pressure of thinking about your chapter tactics and your special doctrines and your special characters and your chapter specific relics, is that it makes it a lot more simple just to pick up and start following that army and continuing following it in a way which is a little bit more enjoyable, I'd argue, because everything still fits together quite nicely on the whole. It's also worth remembering that Orcs are far more forgiving with their special characters. You can take any special character with any culture, they just simply don't get those keywords. So if you like things like Gazgul or Badruk or Snickrot, you're far more free to take them than you are in other armies. It doesn't put pressure on your choice of culture the way it does with Space Marine chapters. Up next in my good choices of potential starter armies, Death Guard. Death Guard may be a bit of an odd choice, but you have to remember that their codex was obviously, in 8th edition, one of the starter armies that you got. And even though they have been given a bit more depth, they haven't been given so much more complexity as to make them impenetrable to new players. Whilst you do have things such as the Companies of Contagion, or the 7 Blight Companies, Plague Companies, I believe they're called, they themselves don't complicate the actual playing of Death Guard. Once you wrap your head around things such as the Contagions of Nurgle and their chapter traits and things like Disgusting Resilience, they are actually quite straightforward to play. There's a lot of depth, but depth just means you have more options that all tend to follow a very similar thread. But ultimately it does mean that when you want to start exploring the codex and get to know it a bit better, then it's actually quite a rewarding experience. And unlike some other armies, you're not locked off by those options if you want to go one way. You can always refer back to what else is in the codex for other units, for other characters, well, Typhus or Mortarion, but I mean specifically in terms of the Fetid Virion ones, so the characters that offer buffs and bonuses to your army, and a lot of the other units that you wouldn't initially think to use, but when you go back to the codex later on, you can think about them in a slightly more open way, and you can decide for yourself if you're interested in using them. And another thing which makes Death Guard actually really quite accessible is the fact that they only have a handful of core units. So when it comes to trying to figure out what is core and what isn't core, it's easier to remember. And the other thing about them is they all fill a very specific role. They tend to either be combat units, in the case of the Terminators and the Possessed, or they tend to be troop units, such as the Plague Marines. In that respect, they have a little bit more versatility. So it's very easy to get your head around what each unit does very quickly and not feel too stressed out or overwhelmed by having a huge range dumped on you. And the other reason I say Death Guard over Chaos Marines is because while Chaos Marines are fairly straightforward, because it's so much broader with all the extra legions and all the relics and warlord traits and stratagems that don't necessarily relate to each other in that codex, it's very easy to start finding things that don't necessarily fit together, and it's easy to get lost and feel that you're playing with a much thinner army than you may have wanted to originally. So if I can quickly summarise on the armies that I've discussed so far, Astra Militarum, very straightforward playstyle, very easy to understand what the next best steps are, normally you just need more of what you've already got, and very easy and understandable and digestible rules, not too many special rules to get bogged down in. Orcs, the fun catharsis that you get from having an army of ramshackle units, but again, everything's very straightforward, everything fits together very well as an army. The options themselves are quite cohesive and they fit back together with each other very well, and it's very hard to get lost in the labyrinth of a codex, and it's a lot more forgiving on you as a player if you want to expand in different directions to what you initially wanted to. And then last of all, Death Guard, a very deep codex, but a codex that's rewarding once you understand it. Getting your head around the basics of the codex itself can be very straightforward, and ultimately once you know how each unit plays on the board, you can then start to expand and experiment and get to know the codex better. Brilliant. Now, my final two choices might sound like odd ones, but they are very interesting, I think it's fair to say, as armies, and that's why I think they should not be written off necessarily as starter armies. And these are armies that are both good to start off with, but they're also good if you want to approach a slightly more advanced way of playing down the line, but you can keep it simple if you want to. The first one is Chaos Demons. Chaos Demons we don't talk about a huge amount these days, first of all because I don't think they've had anything as enormous in terms of the range updates since their plastic range really finished being re-released around about 2016, and they haven't had the enormous shake-up to their rules that a lot of the armies have had since 8th and 9th edition. Granted, they've had a lot of changes since 7th edition, but they haven't had that wow moment. But ultimately their codexes and their range are still both very solid and very interesting. And the good thing about Chaos Demons is that if you want to start off with an army that specialises in one area, such as magic for Tzeentch, speed for Slanesh, and hardcore combat for Khorne, you can do that. And it's very good to have an army that's both also quite straightforward to paint and also very easy to understand in the macro, because whilst the rules can get very complicated, they are only as complicated as your army is. If you have an army which is even a soup army with different demons from different gods, provided that you have the basic understanding as to what all demons from that category get, it's quite easy to get your head around. But if you want things to get complicated, such as bringing in things, especially like special characters for the demons, are very difficult to get your head around, and understanding how things such as the psychic powers work across the army, if you've got psykers from different gods, for example, so if you've got one from Slaanesh and one from Nurgle, then it can get very complicated. But ultimately that's down to you, and if you want to keep it simple and stick to just one god, then you can. The other reason I'd say this is a relatively good starting army is because there's so much to explore and to understand in the Chaos Demon Codex, is it can also be quite forgiving, especially if you want to get 1 or 2 units from a different god that do things that are different to what your army does. And the reason I say this is quite good for demons and slightly better than it is for Space Marines is because ultimately all Space Marines are in power armor and they all come with a certain level of equipment and a certain uniformity and homogeneity in their units. Demons have a lot more variety in this respect as well. So you can have units from Slaanesh and units from Nurgle that will have completely different stat lines and completely different abilities, but because they're so specific to what they do, it makes it a lot easier to get your head into it and very easy to understand what these things are. I would say that the actual kits themselves can be a little bit more complicated to actually paint, simply because of the techniques involved, but that doesn't mean they should be written off, and they're definitely a good starter army in my opinion for these reasons. Anyway, last of all, my other wildcard army, which is a great starter army. Tau are quite a good starter army because they have one thing they do really well, which is obviously ranged combat and have a relatively diverse range, but obviously also has a quite a specific aesthetic. It's quite good if you want to have one particular playstyle that you want to focus on and you want to remain with that for the time being. The other thing I'd say about Tau as a starter army is because you do have things such as your infantry with your fire warriors, your breachers, then your bigger things such as your battle suits, your broadsides, and then your massive war suits, is that you do have a good range of scale, and it's very easy to use what you're ready to buy next as a barometer for where you are in the game. Starting off with things like battle suits and fire warriors as being the largest things in your army is a good way to get to grips with the rules before you start getting to used to things with decreasing stat lines or using monsters or using Lords of War. This is a really good thing to bear in mind because unlike a lot of other armies, Tau have remained very consistent in terms of what they actually play with. Yes, they are very much mono combat style. They can be either a very fast gun line or a very static gun line. They don't sadly have much in between, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're any slouch for it, and you can get quite a lot of variety within that. And because you have one thing that they do very well, it does allow your approach to doing that one thing to be quite experimental. Do you want to be a very powerful close range army, or do you want to be a better at long range? Do you want to be able to move quickly? There's a lot of options you can do with Tau, and because it allows organic growth in this respect, it does mean that you can get to grip both with the core rules and with the codex in your own time, and in a manner that's actually very easy to understand and to learn from. And Tau ultimately is a very forgiving codex as well. Unlike a lot of other armies, including a couple of the ones I've mentioned, because everything still fits together in a very simple aesthetic way, it does mean that if you want to try different things with that army and you want to get new units into that army, they slot in very easily and very quickly. It's not like some armies who have very specific ways of doing things. If I go back to the example earlier on of demons, the one thing that doesn't forgive you very nicely on demons is if you have units that are from different gods that you don't actually know how to synergize with units from different gods particularly well, then that's something to bear in mind. But Tau don't have this problem, so I'd say they're a good starter army and definitely one that you can use as a good entry level one. The only reason I think that some people don't see them as a starter army is that some of their rules are quite complicated, especially in terms of how their cadre system and caste system works, but ultimately the more you get to know the codex, those sorts of things come with time, and it's still much more straightforward than getting your head around these supplements. So just quickly sum up these last two. Demons are good if you want to get to know one particular play style and then tentatively step out into how other things can work differently at the other extreme, but ultimately can still be taken in the same army, so you don't have to worry about starting a whole new army. And Tau are a very strong army for a very forgiving codex that can get complicated, but only as complicated as you make it, the more things you start to put into it, and it's a very good way of measuring when you're ready to start moving on to bigger and more advanced units. So those are my suggestions for alternative starter armies that could be quite useful for new players. Like I said at the beginning, Space Marines do have a place as a starter army, but there are others out there that can definitely help people try different things. And the reason I think it's worth remembering this is because there's no fixed way to start playing 40k. There should be many different ways. Different people should have different ways in, and as a result the game itself grows. If everyone has the same couple of starter armies and everyone starts from the same place, then we all see the game from a very similar place as well. And ultimately it's better that we all see it from a slightly different perspective. It will make the game grow and change in different ways over the years. Are there any other armies that you think are good starter armies? Do you think Space Marines are the only other starter army, and that various armies, in terms of how the codexes work edition to edition, can take the slot of the opposing army? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. So those are some alternative starter armies that if you have friends who want to get into 40k, then these are places for them to start if they're not that keen on Space Marines or Necrons for the time being. And if there's any other armies you think are quite good for starters, then please do leave them in the comments below. There'll be a video every week, and I hope you guys really did enjoy watching this one. Thank you very much for joining me, goodbye, and have a lovely day.